Hello everyone, Jules here. Today I'm going to talk about some astrology books because I've had a request to talk about some books about Chiron. And Chiron is a large asteroid that is almost as big as a planet. So it's kind of referred to as a planetoid by astronomers because it's not quite large enough to be a planet, but it's a very large asteroid. So I'm going to talk about some Chiron books, and I'm also going to talk a bit about the Chiron Return that happens in your natal chart as well. So the first book is probably the most well-known book about Chiron, and it's called Chiron and the Healing Journey by Melanie Reinhart. And this is the first edition of the book, and there's an updated version, an updated edition of this book now. And a lot of people think this was the first book written about Chiron. This book was written and published in 1989, and it was not actually the first book written about Chiron. The first book about Chiron was written about 6 years before, in 1983, and that was written by Richard Knoll, who I think is an American astrologer. And this book was written 6 years later in 1989. Melanie Reinhart is really seen as the expert on Chiron. So this is a great book. It talks about Chiron in the chart, and it talks about Chiron in the signs and the houses, and I think there's also some information on aspects in the chart as well. It gives a good background to the mythology involved with Chiron as well. And what I also love about this book is she associates Chiron with the sign of Virgo, and I agree with that, because Virgo is associated with healing, and Chiron is known as the wounded healer. Chiron is associated with one of the centaurs who was wounded and became a healer. And Chiron is also associated with herbalism. He was a herbal healer. So herbalism is associated with the sign of Virgo as well. So that's why I particularly see Chiron associated with the sign of Virgo, and I agree with Melanie Reinhart about that. I just wanted to mention the Richard Knoll book that was written 6 years before this one about Chiron. It was different to this book. It was a smaller book, but what was really interesting about the book by Richard Knoll, which is probably very hard to get now, I like what he actually also said about Chiron. He said that it wasn't, he didn't associate Chiron so much with the wound or the wounded healer. He acknowledged that, but what he particularly wrote about, which I find really interesting, is that he saw Chiron in the chart as a kind of a compulsion, something that we are driven by and feel that we must do during our lifetime. And in a strange way, to me, that's got an association with the sign of Virgo as well. because Virgo is very much to do with doing, and it's to do with correction and fixing something. So in a way I can see that as well. But what I started to think about and what I found was true was, I know from my own chart with my Chiron position that for me the Chiron position has felt like that. It has felt like something that I was compelled and driven to correct. So I do agree with that theory by Richard Knoll. I think that's quite true, as well as the wounded healer theory. So I actually agree with both theories about that. Anyway, back to this book. It's a great book. It's really worth getting. And on here you can actually see the symbol for Chiron on here. It looks like a key. And it is very much like that. It is the key to wounded issues. And I think the symbol is quite appropriate for Chiron. So this book is available in a later edition, as I was saying before. The newer edition is quite expensive. If you can get this version, this earlier version, on Amazon, it's worth having. I find that the newer edition has information about the other asteroids that have also been associated with centaurs. So if you particularly want the updated edition that has the other centaur information in there as well for the other asteroids, well, that's okay, but this book is worth having because it particularly focuses on Chiron, and it's a great book, and it's likely to be a better price. So this is Chiron and the Healing Journey by Melanie Reinhart. The next book on Chiron is not as well known, but it's quite a good book. This is called Chiron by Barbara Hand Clow, and she calls it, the subtitle is Rainbow Bridge Between the Inner and Outer Planets. This book was written about 4 years after the Melanie Reinhart book. This was written in 1993. It might be a little bit hard to get, but you could probably get it on Amazon. It was published by Llewellyn. And this is a really interesting book. And she referred to Chiron as the Rainbow Bridge because it is positioned between Saturn and the outer planets. So Barbara Hand Clow sees this as a rainbow bridge type of asteroid. So I really like that. And this book, of course, talks about Chiron through the signs and houses, and I think there's some aspects in here as well. And it is a different approach to Chiron compared to the Melanie Reinhart book. Barbara Hand Clow has an approach that's a bit out there. It's a bit different, but it's quite good, and she sees Chiron as a wounded healer as well. But I think this book focuses more on the rainbow bridge aspect between Saturn and the outer planets. So this one is Chiron by Barbara Hand Clow, and it might be out of print, so you'll probably have to get this one on Amazon. Next one is not as well known. This was written by an Australian astrologer. This is Chiron, and the subtitle is Healing Body and Soul. This is published by Llewellyn as well. Written by Martin Lass. And Martin Lass particularly focuses on Chiron. He is an Australian astrologer. He's not all that well known overseas, I don't think. This is quite a good book. This again is probably out of print, and you'd have to get this on Amazon. This was published in 2005. And it's quite a good book. I quite like this book because it's written by someone who is a bit like Melanie Reinhart, because he is a Chiron enthusiast. He's particularly interested in Chiron and seems to specialise in Chiron in the chart. So this talks about Chiron in the signs and houses, and there's aspects in here, aspects in the chart. He seems to take the same approach as Melanie Reinhart, and it's just another good book on Chiron if you want another book on Chiron, because there aren't many books written about Chiron. There are the 3 books I've talked about here, and the book by Richard Knoll, which is quite hard to get now. And that's all I've ever really seen over the years. So because I was asked as a request to talk about some Chiron books, these are the 3 that I have. And you could look into the book by Richard Knoll if you want to, but it is very hard to get. So I'll put those details below the video. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about Chiron and the Chiron Return now. Chiron has a return period. It takes 51 years to return to the position of the natal chart. And I can tell you from experience, I have had my Chiron return. And the interesting thing about the Chiron return is some people or some astrologers have a theory that the Chiron return can kind of bring back the origin of the Chiron wound in the chart, and bring that back to awareness. And there is that theory, and I think for some people, yes, that would happen. What happened for me with my Chiron return is the other thing that can happen, which is if you have done the work on your Chiron position, you will actually receive healing for that original wound. And I am really pleased to say that yes, that has happened for me. And what happens with Chiron in the chart is I have found that yes, there is a woundedness with Chiron in the chart, in a particular sign and in a particular house, so in a particular way. But I find that most people are not so aware of the Chiron issues unless it particularly is aspecting or it is connected with a personal planet. By that I mean sun, moon, Mercury, Venus or Mars. In my chart, it is associated with a personal planet, and it is also an important planet for my chart. So yes, I was very aware of my Chiron position, and yes, I did feel very motivated and almost driven to keep on working on that aspect of myself. So the great news is that at the age of 51, Chiron returns to the natal position, and it's like the eggs coming home to roost a bit, because if you have done the work, you have got a better chance of that wound being healed. So because I have experienced that healing, what has been really good for me is I am able to distance myself from that wound now, which is really good. What happens is, yes, you know, that wound is there, but there is healing, and it's like the wound heals and there is a scar left, but you are not as motivated or distracted by that as much, so that you don't keep on returning to that wounded issue all the time. And because you can distance yourself, that really helps, because you know you have done the work, you know that you have addressed that issue, you know that will always be a part of yourself, but you will then be able to focus on other things and actually move on with your life. So I wanted to let you know about that, what can happen with the Chiron return, that you can actually receive the healing by that time. And I suppose it's good that you have up to 51 years to do that. And of course, if you didn't do enough work, or if you haven't done any work on those Chiron wounding issues, then yes, it's like the wound is going to be opened up again, and you're going to be really caught up in that. So what people could do is, if they have not done enough work on those issues, as you approach the Chiron return, and particularly once you are at the Chiron return as well, you could really put all of your work in, your inner work, once and for all, to deal with those issues, and then you've got a better chance of healing that wound. Because I think what happens until then is there is almost like a compulsion to keep on returning to that wound, and it not only prevents you from moving on with your life and doing other things, it can almost put you into a type of victim mode where it becomes automatic and you don't realise that you are actually identifying with the wound. So I wanted to talk about that because I have experienced the Chiron return, and I'm really pleased to say that I have received that healing resolution to those issues, and I am more distant from those issues now. So I feel that I don't have to keep on addressing that type of issue anymore. And I think it actually helps you as well, not only personally, but it helps you if you are in a type of healing profession, or you give healing advice on any matter. if you have done that kind of work, you are going to be in a better position to help people. Because if you are still caught up in your own Chiron issues, it will probably cause you to have some bias and will cause setbacks, and you might even be possibly projecting some of that onto clients as well. So I just wanted to talk a bit about Chiron and the Chiron Return. So I'll put the books below the video. And the only one more thing I wanted to say about Chiron in the chart as well is I was saying that people are more aware of the Chiron position, particularly if it is connected with your personal planets. Otherwise, it tends to be more of a subconscious inkling, where you know that there seems to be a problem somewhere, but you don't know what it is. And that might be the sort of thing that you might need an astrologer to help you with that. I think the only exception to that would be if you had Chiron position in very close aspect to your rising sign or ascendant. But it's particularly more to do with personal planets, I have found. Okay, so there's some thoughts about Chiron and the Chiron Return, and I'll put the details below the video about the books. So thanks for watching. Bye for now.